Washington, and the European capitals, weary after 10 years of conflict in the Balkans, knew the dangers in Macedonia and wanted to move quickly to head off another war. Macedonia had the potential to seize the US security agenda for the Bush team, just as Bosnia and Kosovo had done for the Clinton administration.
We're clearly by then, I think in fact and in perception, Macedonia's closest friend, Ambassador Chris Hill, who was the first U.S. ambassador. We'd had a liaison office there previously. He played an outsized role in the country, knew the region very well, and we faced, the insecurity from outside because of the, Yugoslavs tensions post-Yugoslavia, and certainly the very tense relationship with Greece at that time. And then the Albania relationship. Now that changed even by the time I had come back as ambassador. Albania and Macedonia, North Macedonia, actually have a very good bilateral relationship. They sort of, I think, understand each other, but there was a fair amount of tension then, the concerns about Raider Albania. There was some goal for that. So questions of identity, certainly questions of territory, mixed history, and thrown in there as religion as well as the whole transition from communism. So these were all things that the United States, in trying to maintain a bilateral relationship that was focused on maintaining stability and security in the region, and always worried about the underlying concerns about ethnic tensions within Macedonia, particularly as we saw what was happening in Kosovo.
What was clearly going on in Kosovo, whether the Serbs were ordering people out or whether the Serbs were simply saying or behaving in a way that people felt they had to leave, lots of people left. And the problem for Macedonia at the time, we usually estimated their population around 2 million. And they had about, according to official numbers, is about 23% were Albanians. So if you got 2 million people, of whom there are 23% or so Albanians, and then you kind of empty out Kosovo, which at the time was sort of 1.8 million or so, and you bring in a lot more Albanians. Does that change the overall population distribution? Do you get Macedonia suddenly having an Albanian majority population? We didn't think so. I sure didn't think so. But there are a lot of people worried about that sort of thing. So one of the issues was, that concern that you just have people flooding over the border and then changing the whole demographic situation in Macedonia was part of it. But the other more serious part was, what are you going to do with these people?
I was at the border every day and I saw one woman with a baby, and the baby had one sock on and not the other one. And I'm not emotional at all. To the contrary, I'm pretty cynical. But that was something broke in me. And I said to my boss, Charlie Stonesafe, I said, Charlie, the Macedonian government is not going to do much. Let's you and I do something. And so we went to a crop dusting airstrip. It was fenced off. There was water, there was electricity. And we ran into the Royal Engineers there, and we asked them if they would give us men to build a refugee camp. And they said, you give us the goods, we will build you the camp. Because the US military back then, they said we had to fight not to babysit refugees. And overnight, the Royal Engineers, actually, we went back to the embassy and we said to Ambassador Hill, look, we have this great idea about location of a refugee camp. And he said, oh, you do? Just beep, 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 beep. Hey, Stroop, how are you, man? Stroop Talbot. And he said, we have this, Charlie here and Mitko have this idea about the refugee camp. He says, do we have money? He said, yeah, go ahead. And we built a refugee camp.
And I remember on that Sunday morning, it was actually Easter morning, and we we had about 150 refugees go there. We knew that number was going to increase. And by the end of the day, it was a couple of thousand. By Thursday or so, it was a total of 65,000 people. But they were safe. And that's the first thing you got to think of about refugees, their safety. Second thing you got to think about is, do they have food? Do they have sanitary situation? And so all of that was taken care of through this Stenkovats camp, but it was not an easy process getting it set up. And then no one knew how long this was going to go on. There were people who said, oh, once we bomb the Serbian military, they'll give up in 2 days. Well, I never believed that, to be honest with you. And most people who knew anything about Serbia didn't believe that either, because we were into day 77 and it was still going on. And remember, the point was to hit Serbian military targets, try to erode their ability to conduct ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, but also to convince Slobodan Milosevic to pull his military out of Kosovo and allow NATO to come in. And there was no sense of when this was finally going to happen.
You have to remember the Kosovo War was seen as, Madeline's war. Madeleine Albright, Secretary of State, that we were taking these actions against Milosevic, having failed to try to negotiate a peaceful resolution with working with the Europeans, the Rambouillet process. There was NATO took military action against Milosevic's forces. That, of course, lasted a lot longer than people anticipated.
There are many Serbs living in Macedonia. I think it's fair to say, some Macedonians who agreed with the proposition that Serbia was being unjustly charged with these heinous crimes in Kosovo. That after all, there were atrocities being committed on both sides. And so there was a demonstration in front of the American embassy in March 25th. And the demonstration, over the course of the day, people were throwing eggs, and before you know it, they were throwing rocks, and before you know it, they were lighting the place on fire. So we lost a lot of vehicles in our parking lot. All the outbuildings were destroyed. And in the embassy itself, fortunately, our locked doors held. But at one point, they took our flagpole, used it as a battering ram to try to knock in the front door. Thank goodness the front door held. Meanwhile, many of us, over 40 of us to be precise, waited out in the basement, hoping for relief from either the Macedonian police or U.S. forces, a few of which were located out at the embassy, out at the airport. I'm sorry. At one point, I was sort of worried. Well, I saw them burning. I could see that they're burning cars, burning outbuildings. What if one of these Molotov cocktails gets in the embassy, through the bars, through a broken window, but between the bars? What if a curtain catches on fire? What if the embassy catches on fire? I'm thinking about, and I didn't want to share that with anybody, but this is running through my mind. And then I kind of look around, and I was thinking, if the embassy burns down, we're going to have to get out of here, but maybe we won't be able to get out of here by the door by which we came in. So is there any other way to get out of here? And I saw this trap door. And I remember asking one of the Macedonian employees, a guy named Mitko, I said, Mitko, do you have any idea where that door leads? He said, yeah, it leads out. It goes right up in the parking lot. I don't think we want to go out there because there are all these demonstrators out there. But he probably didn't understand why I looked so relieved at the fact that we had another way out. So about an hour and a half or so later, finally, the demonstration calmed down. People left. The Macedonian police came in, used tear gas, dispersed the crowd. We had some U.S. troops take control of the compound. They strung concertina wire. There's barbed wire around it, and kind of buttoned us up for the night.
So the next day we showed up at the embassy in the morning to work, and it had been, secured by our a Marine, emergency response team. So there was a machine gun on the roof. There was all sandbags everywhere. The rose garden gone, everything, and these wonderful Marines had nowhere to sleep, so they were in the hallways and everything, sleeping when their shift was off. So it quite dramatically changed everything about the way we worked. And the overwhelming reaction from all our Macedonian friends was deep shame and guilt that this happened. They had always, no one that we knew, Albanians, Macedonians, no one was happy or proud of this. The United States, they always wanted to be the 51st state on both ethnic sides of Macedonia. They didn't want this to happen. And I think there was, a lot of sympathy and support in reaction to that. This was a particular, Serb community that did this.
And then we had a big decision. Do we stay or do we evacuate the embassy? I felt that to evacuate the embassy was to invite the prospect that other embassies would also evacuate, because a lot of embassies look to our embassy for their cue. So I was concerned that if we evacuated, we'd lose other embassies. I decided we'd stay. And we kind of buttoned ourselves down. I think it was the right decision. Everyone else stayed, and Macedonia gradually recovered its footing, and we didn't have any more of those rather tough demonstrations. And we continued, and I think fairly successfully.
The only time when it would have been not always safe to say who you work for was in that period, 99 to 2001. And I'm not sure whether it was because of 2001 conflict in Macedonia, but I would say that rather it was about the 99 NATO bombarding to Serbia. As I was talking before, the countries were very closely related to each other. The people were very closely related. There were a lot of mixed families, people moving from one place to another, having relatives in Serbia. So what was happening there, and I don't know, you probably know about 99 when they started to burn down the embassy. So that were the times when the United States was not the best friend of Macedonian people. The perception was that it was not the best friend.
You can trace a chain back to the early 1990s or even further, right? In which the breakup of Yugoslavia had a particular impact on Albanians, Yugoslav citizens of Albanian who identify as Albanians, right? Because within Yugoslavia, first of all, the very name itself is a little bit exclusionary if you're not a Slav. There were more Albanians in Yugoslavia than there were either Macedonians or Slovenians, but the Albanians did not get a republic. So the Albanians were split among Montenegro, Serbia proper, sorry, I should say. They were mostly concentrated in Kosovo and northwestern Macedonia, with significant populations also in Montenegro and in Serbia outside Kosovo's borders. The problem, if you're a member of that community, right, within Yugoslavia, what we saw was political activism, especially within Kosovo, to try and get Kosovo to be recognized as a republic, because that was the legal pathway to greater standing and recognition and rights, a sort of sense of ownership of the political system in which you live.
I was very interested in the questions of human rights, and I engaged with the leadership of the Albanian community. There were about 3 issues that I remember that they brought to me. And one, of course, was one thing that they talked about was their housing conditions and how they had been discriminated against, and how the way they lived was not comparable to how the Macedonians lived. I engaged with them and said, okay, number one, if you look at the situation, the government hasn't been the government for a very long time. Number 2, there's not a lot of money out there to address any issue right off the bat. And so absent a wand, there's not much that's going to be done in the immediate future on that. But I also pointed out that while they might have high expectations or opinions of the bloc apartment buildings that where Macedonians mostly lived. They hardly looked like places that I wanted to live, whereas the Albanian quarters at least had some style. While they may need investment and some may have dirt floors, if things progress well, I frankly would have preferred to live in the Albanian quarter. And I was actually on the Albanian television program one evening, and under pretty intense questioning, acknowledged that there were issues that needed to be addressed, but at the same time said that I thought that there were other things that things had to be prioritized. I think that got me some points, not only with the Albanians, because I was willing to talk to them and engage and listen to what they had to say, but with the Macedonians. The other issue was instruction in Albanian language, which, as I delved into the situation, and one would have to get into the diplomatic record to find, it turned out to me that there was more access to some Albanian instruction than was being let on. While it certainly wasn't adequate, it took some of the pressure off, and again allowed people to say that this is a situation that needs to be addressed, but not necessarily something that the international community has to come down on you like a ton of bricks.
Some of the ethnic Albanians studied in Skopje at the State University Kiril and Methodi, and other Albanians went to Pristina to get their education in whatever they wanted. You know, the University of Pristina was big. You could the natural sciences and social sciences. There was everything there. But then Slobodan Milosevic closed the border, and the Albanians could no longer go to Pristina to study. And children were growing up, and their numbers were growing, and because throughout their life, they were educated in their mother tongue, in the Albanian language. When they would come to the Skopje University, they needed 6 to 10 months to polish their Macedonian. They spoke Macedonian, but it was, not the Macedonian to study law with. And the frustration grew, and they said, hell, why can't we be educated in our mother tongue? And in 1997, they opened a university, some say legal, some say illegal. And there were demonstrations and protests in Skopje where young kids, like high school kids, were protesting against education in the Albanian language, in the tertiary education in the Albanian language. Opinions still differ if it was good or bad for the country, because now we have two parallel worlds. Because from the day they are born, the ethnic Albanian kids, they go to kindergarten in Albanian, primary school, secondary school, and university in the Albanian language. And then, how do you get a job in a bank in Skopje if you don't speak the language of the majority? But the country lost one unifying factor. Good or bad, it happened. So that was one of the elements for the insurgency. Another element was misrepresentation in the public administration. Like, I think that only 4% of the police were ethnic Albanians. In Macedonia, not in Yugoslavia. In Yugoslavia, I don't know. They felt disenfranchised. They were not included in the society in Yugoslavia and later on in Macedonia. They were included in the elites, but not in the, down at the pyramid. And because they couldn't get jobs with the administration, they all became craftsmen, and they knew what to do. And when the socialist system fell apart, they started making money. They were more mobile. They used to go, they emigrated to more for whatever reason. They were more mobile. They still are. And, the frustration among them grew. Eventually, when there was no solution to the education problem, there was no solution to the employment, the solutions were partial and I would say sloppy, because they opened a quota, like your what do you call it, affirmative action. So 10% or 15% of slots at the universities were reserved for the ethnic communities. The process was slow. Politically, the ruling parties, Macedonian and Albanian, they had a good idea. They had a good concept. They wanted to promote ethnic Albanian students into assistant and teaching professors at the university, and then form groups, because it was never illegal to study in a foreign language in Macedonia. I was educated in the English language. Yeah? My people that studied French language and literature, they did that. And they thought, we'll get the talented kids, we'll put them on fast track to be teachers, assistant teaching professors, and then we'll have groups. And for example, now we have one ethnic Albanian professor who teaches constitutional law. We'll take the Albanian kids, and because then kids would mingle at the same university. But when they took it slow, they had the Albanian opposition on the streets. When they moved it fast, they had VMRO on the streets. And, it was a vicious circle, and it was like a catch-22. And, it led to further and further frustration.
1999, the whole, when basically the peak of the conflict in between Serbia and Kosovo, I would say probably in 2001 we have experienced the spillover from that conflict in North Macedonia, because with the Serbia attack on Kosovo and bombarding of NATO in Serbia and everything that was going on back then, we have seen a huge influx of refugees in the country that was still economically very weak. So it was not strong enough as a democracy. It was only, so it was 10 years, less than 10 years of independence, of establishment of its democracy itself, and the economy was still going on through this very turbulent transition period. So I would say that it came out from outside. I still believe that was the situation. Because again, I cannot talk smartly about what was happening in late 80s or beginning of 90s, because as I said, the politics was not a topic that we were following that much closely. But it just, I think that whatever was happening in Kosovo, I think that some groups found a place in North Macedonia where they could exercise their military.
There were a lot of weapons in the region. A lot of those were picked up by ethnic Albanians in Macedonia through the mountains, sort of formed their own version of the Kosovo Liberation Army. And, they had an agenda and grievances. The fairly right-wing government dominated by the VMRO party, the ethnic Macedonians, was seen as tough. All the standard issues we're used to, language and other things, they were pretty inflexible on some of these issues. And so you started having sporadic violence similar to what had happened in Kosovo.
I think it's inaccurate to call it an insurgency. I mean, maybe that reflects that I spend more time with Macedonians than Albanians in Macedonia, but I don't think Macedonian Albanians would not call it that. Okay, so now you've got military capacity built in Kosovo, and you've got incredibly strong kin ties and historical alignment between the Albanian population of North Macedonia and in Kosovo, who, remember, until 1991 don't have a border separating them. So they're moving back and forth. They're in alliance. They're pursuing some similar kinds of goals. Some of the demonstrations that triggered Serb reaction against Kosovars in Kosovo actually were triggered by demonstrations or actions in North Macedonia, right? So the kind of ways that Albanian protests against Yugoslav security forces, heavy-handed tactics were a feature of life in North Macedonia as well as in Kosovo. They just weren't as reported. So you've got capacity, you've got a template all in place to potentially reinforce the persuasive power of leaders in Albanian leaders in North Macedonia who say, enough with the patience, enough with the collaboration, enough with working with these people. It's time we took up arms. That's the way we get anything done. The Kosovo Albanian leadership who had been advocating and pursuing a policy of nonviolent resistance, inspired by Gandhi, inspired by solidarity in Poland, right? They were trying to achieve political aims without switching to violence. And the lesson that they and others, I think, in the Balkans took from Dayton and elsewhere is, if you want to get international attention, then violence is the best way to do it. It turns out they're not really going to pay attention if you stick to nonviolence.
Things that drove the conflict, this is a key point, that drove the conflict in 2001 was the press. The Macedonian language press was egging the Macedonians on into the fight. And it was a precursor to a lot of what we see today in social media, on Twitter and other places like this one. Can we drive wedges into society? Can we whip politicians into doing things that they probably know they shouldn't do, but public opinion is being affected? And right now what's going on in North Macedonia is a lot of similarity. And there's a bunch of newspapers there that are very, very extreme nationalistic, kind of pro-Russian, the deal with Greece on the name, the deal that is being cut with the European Union and Bulgaria over the terms of accession to the European Union is being whipped up into, fury and hate and all the rest of this good stuff. So the press, the Macedonian language press bears a fair amount of the blame for the conflict in 2001.
After the Kosovo War, there was, they were enthusiastic because the West helped. They bombarded Belgrade and, other parts of Serbia. And the ethnic Albanians, some of them said, hell, this is our chance. And I honestly believe that in the early days, that movement was not for human rights. It was never for human rights. But how they described them, I will not use a description that we had in the embassy, but I will quote George Robertson, who was then Lord Robertson, who was then Secretary General of NATO. He says that they are violent thugs who prefer bullets to ballots. That's how they described them in the beginning.
So 2001 comes along, and this is, I did a lot of research before I got to, so I arrived in Macedonia on January 12th or 13th of 2002, and they sent me down there, not as ambassador, they sent me down there on temporary duty, what we call TDY, when the ethnic Albanians, Macedonian version of the KLA, began, popping up with AK-47s and explosives and, trying to occupy space along the border region between Kosovo and Macedonia. The Macedonian security force response was to use conventional weapons or conventional force to go after them, which is a losing proposition, because basically every time you kill an insurgent or a guerrilla, you created 10 more, because you've just, you've alienated all their relatives and everybody else. And of course, they were all watching what had happened in 1999, how the KLA took on the Serbs. Of course, they got the NATO came in to help them sort that out. But nonetheless, there's this mythology of guys with Rambo, with things around their, headbands and, sort of big muscles and, and running around with guns and taking on the Macedonians. We had, and this is kind of a hit on us, we had been engaging some, we call it security force assistance in Macedonia, the same ones that train the Croats. We're working with helping the Macedonians, kind of become, NATO already, getting them, in the pipeline to join NATO. But the knee-jerk reaction was, let's use tanks and let's use attack fighter jets to deal with this insurgency. So they bought T-55 tanks, surplus tanks from Bulgaria. They bought some Su-25, which is that's Sukhov fighter bombers. They actually fly. They're still flying up in the airspace around Ukraine, surplus from Ukraine, and they were dropping bombs and using tanks to try and take out guys up in the mountains. That was not ever going to win. That's the conflict, so it starts. And once it starts, there's not a whole lot us diplomats are going to do until people are ready to, put guns down. And this is where we, the US, learned the lesson from Bosnia and from Kosovo of the longer you wait, the worse it gets. So the KLA, or the Macedonian version of that, occupies a town called Arachinovo, which is a fairly large, basically 100% ethnic Albanian community, kind of between Skopje and the airport. And they went in and took it, and captured it, and dared the Macedonian security forces to come and get them. 2 days into that fight, the Minister of Interior, the Minister of Defense told the president of the country, we got this. We'll be, literally the words were, we'll be drinking coffee in the main square of Arachinovo within 24 hours. Well, 3 days later, they were not even close to getting inside. They were like, wait a minute, we're not going to die to take this town. And the guys on the inside actually apparently were prepared to die. And that's when we intervened. Now I'm speaking from using third-hand sources. We had, I think it was the 10th Mountain Division at that point, was the main American military force up in Kosovo. Somebody got on the phone and said, hey, listen, we need to stop this. And the deal got cut with, we came down and we basically escorted all of the ethnic Albanian fighters and their weapons out of Arachinovo up to Kosovo, and which allowed the Macedonian forces to kind of declare victory and kind of like, like sort of not reoccupy Arachinovo, but it's no longer an armed location. And that was the impetus that, where our folks said, okay, now we're going to force you guys to come to the table and negotiate an agreement. And that was the Ohrid Agreement. And the fundamental tenets of the Ohrid Agreement, where Ohrid, of course, is a lake. It's a town and a lake that borders Greece, Macedonia, and Albania. We're going to basically force the Macedonian government to sit down with their Albanian counterparts to create a document which provides greater integration of the ethnic Albanian community into the body politic of Macedonia. Translation, and I use my words, were, we're going to give them a seat at the table and a stake in the outcome of this country. We replicated the Dayton process and the unsuccessful Rambouillet process of bringing in outside negotiators, mediators, which brought everybody to the table and say, okay, you guys have figured out, for the Macedonians, the ethnic Macedonians, armed forces isn't going to win it for you. Hey, KLA, you guys aren't going to, whatever you're trying to achieve, you're not going to achieve it. Let's figure out what it is that's acceptable, minimally acceptable all sides. And the result was the Ohrid Framework Agreement, which, the key parts was, recognizing that, the ethnic Albanians in Macedonia are legitimately there. They legitimately deserve a seat at the table. The towns that are majority ethnic Albanian, and there's, trust me, you don't get a lot of mixed communities except in some of the major cities. They'll have a fair amount of, autonomy is not the right word, but independence. They could run their own affairs.
That was an instance where Jim Pardue, who's, was pretty much a no-nonsense kind of guy, was the right guy for that job, in the sense that he didn't really, sympathize with anybody. He was just like, we got to end this, we got to get it done. And there were some politics that went around him. I remember times President Tchaikovsky went directly to Colin Powell and said, "Look, some of this stuff we want to sign, we want to solve this agreement, but some of this stuff I can't do." And Powell, agreed with him to a certain point and said, "Jim, give a little on this." But in the end, I think it was, a very reasonable way of addressing the whole thing, and got sort of things back under control.
First was James Perdue, Ambassador Perdue. He was not liked by the Macedonians because he was a former soldier and he was given a job to do. He was tasked to end a conflict, and that's what he did the best he knew. He was rude, he was flipping tables, and left the impression that the Americans are with the Albanians only and not with the Macedonians. But then there was another diplomat, French guy, Leotard. We called him Lion Start. And he was later on indicted in a weapons smuggling scandal, a former Minister of Defense of France. Now, they pushed the process to a point, the framework agreement was signed, and then they withdrew. But most of the job was done afterwards when we had one James Holmes, a true gentleman. He, golden glasses, turquoise shirt, and with manners and all that stuff. He spoke softly and smartly. And we had one, Francois Leroy, yeah. And he was representing the European Union. He was French. But we were fortunate to have Ambassador Larry Butler there. And we negotiated the post-framework agreement package.
Our analogy I'd like to use is James Perdue and Francois Leotard, the French negotiator. They were the architects. I was the builder. They gave me the blueprints, and they'd already dug and poured the foundation. Now my job was to build on it. The biggest stumbling block on the Ohrid Framework Agreement came in the summer of 2003, and had to do with decentralization. Under the original Macedonian constitution, there were something like 125 municipalities. Now do the math on that one. There's a country of 2 million people, 125 municipalities, and then there's like 3 major ones, Kumanovo, Skopje, Tetovo, and then kind of the Ohrid area. So you basically had fragmented the country up so that, these municipalities were, had like maybe 2,000 or 3,000 people, the equivalent of townships and hamlets up in my home state of Maine. So if they got no taxing ability, they don't have schools, the power is diffused. And so part of the Ohrid Agreement was that they were going to re-centralize and grow the municipalities so that they would be bigger and have more political heft. Instead of like 3 or 4 major towns and a bunch of towns that nobody cares about, now you've got 25 or 30 major towns and then some smaller ones. So that required negotiations that our friends from the European Union were supposed to be in charge of, except that the Alain Leroy has moved on to other things, went off to be ambassador to Madagascar or someplace like that. And there's a new EU special representative who is a Dane, and it was summertime. He's on vacation. There's, and I've kind of lost the bubble on this. I haven't tracked. It's like the last major piece. And I get a phone call from one of the guys in the EU special representative's office going, we're in deep shit right now. The Albanians have just walked away from the table. The Macedonians aren't budging. They're not agreeing to this, re-centralization, reducing the number of municipalities. We have a crisis. You've got to do something about it. And this is again where it's okay. It's time to go to work. Now, I arranged for the Macedonian police to give me a helicopter. We got onto summer 2004. We fly down to Ohrid to meet with the president, and it's a new president at this point. It's not Tchaikovsky. Tchaikovsky had passed away. So we fly in a helicopter with the EU people, and we meet with him, and he instructs his prime minister, Harry Kostov, that, okay, this is what you need to do. Get back in the helicopter. Now we fly back to Skopje, or actually we fly up to another spot where we land, and we have more negotiations, and then we fly back into Skopje. And now I have a problem of this. This has to be an authentic negotiation on their part. We can't have our fingerprints on it. And this is where I'm going to go very quiet to say we were able to facilitate indirectly because of talking to everybody and then let them get into the room by themselves and come up with a deal to reduce the number from 125 to 75. Prime Minister announced his resignation afterwards because he felt he had to compromise, he had been forced to compromise his previous position. But then this led to a referendum had to be held on consolidating this. And this is how we came to officially recognize Macedonia by its official name. The opponents to the deal were railing against it, and we had to come up with, we need a game changer. What is the game changer? The game changer is, up until then, we had gone by this informal former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia thing that placated the Greeks so the Macedonians could have a seat in the United Nations. We went out on a limb, and the White House came out and formally recognized the country as Republic of Macedonia by their name. And this gave Cervenkovsky and his government, a chance to go out and rally the night before the referendum, and the referendum passed overwhelmingly because people were so excited that finally, a real country have now formally recognized them by the name they've chosen.
NATO membership as a goal, it was Macedonia and Croatia. One of the things that we did during that time, that Secretary Powell did, President Bush did, was recognized Macedonia as the Republic of Macedonia. We stopped the FYROM thing, which caused great consternation among the Greeks, but was an important gesture in showing the country, particularly the ethnic Macedonians, that we respected them and their country, and we had found Greece and Greek governments at that time to be particularly intransigent on the issue. And President Bush just sort of went ahead and said, we're going to recognize it. They want to call themselves, that's fine. That was a big step.
My challenge was, okay, one, we've got to actually go through and implement the power sharing and the subsidiarity and the devolution of the concentration of political power that was created by the original Macedonian constitution. We need to, to work this so that the Albanians have more political control over their communities and whatnot. And one of the problems, so there were three things there. One was the deal. So we had NATO was there, and the OSCE was there. The OSCE there were observers. They're the guys wearing the white uniforms, and we refer to them as the good humor ice cream salesman. They wore white uniforms. We had the NATO forces that were down there as enforcing the peace, not enforcing the peace, but sort of giving confidence the peace was going to hold. But then you still have guys with guns and tanks on one side, and presumably guys with AK-47s and rocket propelled grenade launchers, RPGs, on the other side. We need to now have Macedonian police reintegrate into these communities so people can relax and get back to work. So my to-do list was working my way through all of the elements of the framework agreement. And there's a secondary problem, which is actually a bigger one. There's national elections coming up in early summer, May, June. And the VMRO, DPME was the main party that controlled the prime minister and the defense ministry and all of the key ministries, all the security ministries. And they were hardline ethnic Slavic Macedonian nationalists. They were very resistant. So the president, you got the president on one hand, who is the commander in chief, but then you have the government, which is run, and he was very amenable to implementing the framework agreement, but he's not getting a lot of help. And he was from that party. He's not getting a lot of help from Georgievsky, the prime minister, and his guys. And I just spent all of my time, my first couple of months there was developing relationships so we can have influence. This is what we diplomats do. You can't do it via Zoom. You got to do it in person. You got to sit down. You have to eat with them. You have to drink with them. You have to walk with them. You have to ski with them, and you have to be able to have this confidence that what you told me is not going any further. I'm not going to go out rat to the police and stuff like that. And then likewise, the big challenge for me was, how do I bring the ethnic Albanian fighters in from the cold? How do I get them to put the guns down? How do I get them to swap the bullets for ballots? But again, it's trust. So the OSCE trusted me. The Albanians trust us, the Americans. Having said that, if one side perceives you as friendly to the other side, you must be their enemy. So I took a lot of heat. The Americans took a lot of heat from the ethnic Macedonians that we were pro-Albanian and anti-Macedonian. And that was a problem that I think I still haven't shaken until today. I still occasionally get, hit pieces in Macedonian press attacking me for things that happened, do the math on this one, like 20 years ago.
Ambassador Butler was exactly what the country needed. He was energetic. He liked to go out. With him, we organized, once the war was over, there were landmines everywhere. People were afraid to go back to the fields, so we organized a tractor offensive. Almost every day we were out in the field telling people it's safe, and we had minesweepers from the State Department demining office or something like that, and they were sweeping the fields, and people gradually went back to work.
9 months later, it would have been all very different, or it might not have happened at all then because of our own 9/11. How then the entire focus of our engagement and the world's focus changed. And you have to remember, in those years, the Balkans really was, it was front page news all the time, from Bosnia through to the Kosovo War, and then Macedonia a little less so. While Kosovo, you have to remember, was still trying to work itself out.
One failure that we have, and it's not our fault, is that over the years, the ethnic Albanian political parties were very successful of selling the fake story that the Americans are their allies only in the country. Macedonians, for some reason, believe the ethnic Albanians more than they believe the embassy, because we tell them, hey, that's not true. I'm an insider. I know we're impartial. But the feeling out there, particularly among the Macedonians, is that the Americans are allies with the Albanians. And there is, you can't fight against that, because you can't apply rational tools to an irrational issue.
I do think that if it was not for the United States, I don't know how that conflict would have ended in 2001, because I don't think that our European friends manage well crisis and have shown the maturity to stop or to step in seriously in the situations when you need to step in and offer solutions.
Those few years were the highlight of what the American diplomacy did for the country. Had there not been for the American embassy back then, Macedonia would have been different.